Overcoming by Pure Foy's Girl. Chapter 9. Thanks to the chaos downstairs, and the unexpected arrival of the Diamond clan, luncheon was forfeited, and Will found he was not at all sorry. He was in no state to be in company, not while he was still trembling in the aftermath of the clash with Hannibal. Will suppressed a shiver at the memory of Hannibal's warm fingertips pressing along his jaw, seeking the sensitive little scent glands that Will had worked so hard to render useless. His fingers had felt like coals on his skin, searingly hot and frightening, but Will's heart had hammered in something like excitement, with a keen kind of terrified pleasure in being pinned down and helpless beneath the weight of his bonded alpha. Hannibal had been surprisingly rapt in his attention, his amber eyes half shuttered and his mouth slightly parted as he'd stared down at Will, intent on seeking the source of his scent. He had worried Will even more so in that moment, because he'd felt nothing more than an eager, aching desire to allow Hannibal to do anything he wanted, anything at all, as much a product of his father's abuse as it was the response of touch-starved instincts. Hannibal would be appalled to know it, no doubt, repulsed into turning his noble nose up so he could glare at Will down its length, haughty and secure in his confidence. "It's too dangerous," Will said, leveling a glare at his own reflection. If Hannibal was to find out about the bond Will had to him, then he would use that knowledge, that power he had over Will, to his own advantage. Certainly too dangerous to risk it. Will resolutely returned to the forlorn tea set, and poured himself a cup with hand that still trembled with irritation at Hannibal's high-handed actions. He deeply regretted breaking the other teacup as he had, now that the first flush of emotion was out of him. It was his favorite tea set, long since retired from regular use for missing pieces, but one Jimmy knew he particularly liked for those very reasons. It was not priceless in the ways Hannibal had claimed, but in ways Will alone understood. "It's just the two of us now," he murmured, rubbing his thumb over the lip of the fragile teacup. "I suppose that's just fine." He honestly never knew who he'd hoped would use that second cup. The staff would never serve anyone else with such a set. The fact that Jimmy had brought it into Hannibal's presence at all was just a subtle rebellion on Will's behalf. Yet some part of him had always found hope in that presence of the empty cup waiting on the tray, as if any moment a friend might arrive and share their time with him. It was a pleasant illusion, no more, he knew. "You, Will, are like this teacup. Admittedly beautiful, but serving a function." Hannibal's words had found the crack in his composure, and slithered beneath, an outrageous insult said with such silky seriousness that Will was still aghast at his husband's capacity to entirely and deliberately miss his point. It had taken an example of extreme proportions to get through to his husband, and the sacrifice of something precious to do so. "It will never be whole again," he murmured, grim. "Not in a million years." Angry at Hannibal, angry at himself, Will surged to his feet and put the matter behind him. He viciously scrubbed his neck, jaw, and other scent gland areas with the liquid scent neutralizer Jimmy procured for him on a regular basis, determined that Hannibal not have any reason to claim it was provoking. He couldn't fathom how Hannibal had caught his scent in the first place, since even the Duke had assured Will that the neutralizer was frighteningly effective. He bleakly considered that it could be a side effect of their bonding, but he lacked the experience to know for certain, and refused to borrow trouble. He donned a fresh shirt and waistcoat, abandoning the abused ones to his vast and nearly empty dressing room for Jimmy to take downstairs. He buttoned up and replaced his neckerchief with another one that had been soaked in the neutralizer and left to dry before being ironed free of stiffness. It was still rather scratchy and uncomfortable, but he would much rather bear it than give Hannibal any cause to go running his fingers in where they didn't belong, even if Will's touch-starved body warmed at the suggestion. "I am more than a bundle of mindless instincts," Will reminded himself, settling his jacket on, looking nearly passable enough to meet the Duke's daughter and her family. He gave himself a stern stare in the mirror, trying to swallow down his frustration with himself. "You are not an Omega, Will Graham. You are not a man, nor a woman. You are only yourself, and that is all you ever need be." It was the only thing he could do in his situation. Finish what his father had started, and Hannibal had eagerly continued. Pair all of that Omega nonsense and foolishness out with ruthless force. In a ritual that always helped him feel more in control, Will made himself review what had happened downstairs, as if watching from afar. He analyzed where things had gone wrong, what Hannibal had said to prick his temper into rising, which he seemed to have a talent for. He felt his frustration well up again. Hannibal was insufferable on a good day, most times. It was no surprise he would make the appalling suggestion about a child with a pleased, clueless smile. It was also no surprise that, having been done in, he would give chase. If there was one thing Will was beginning to realize about Hannibal, it was that his husband felt compelled to have the last word on any given subject. "Insufferably arrogant," Will breathed, cheeks growing hot when he recalled how Hannibal tackled him there in the foyer, and been distracted with near immediacy by the very alpha impulses Will's sisters had secretly warned him of. His flush intensified when he imagined what Hannibal's family must think of him. No doubt that he had used his Omegan wiles to seduce Hannibal right there in the doorway, unable to wait for a proper setting for a tryst. He tugged his jacket again, and quickly blotted his forehead and cheeks with the cloth soaked in scent killer, cooling his heated skin. Hannibal had not, however, and much to Will's surprise, left him to flounder in embarrassment alone, at least. It had been entirely unexpected when his husband had tried to soothe him with that firm kneading of his nape, and Will felt gooseflesh rise all over again, recalling the touch. It had calmed him and centered him, though no little part of himself resented and rebelled against it, knowing it was nothing more than mindless instinct at work. The shock of it could not compare to the surprise of Hannibal swinging around behind him, effectively hiding him from scrutiny when he had a perfect opportunity to expose Will, and he could not blame Hannibal for thinking he might struggle. Every interaction they had was a struggle, it seemed. His careful recollection of the instance complete, Will took a deep breath, focusing on his accomplishments and everything he had managed to date here at Hertford House to find his equilibrium again. He was no simpering, silly Omega whose only hope was in a baby. He was a quick mind bent to details who had the misfortune to inhabit a body he had no need of nor desire for. He had spent 6 years living as a beta male with such success that nearly everyone in his limited acquaintance assumed he was one. He was not what Hannibal thought he was. He was intelligent, serious, and calm. It was a difficult reminder to focus on when he had only just been floundering about on the floor, struggling with his husband there in the foyer, both of them behaving appallingly. Will knew if he'd had the time or chance to get hold of something before they'd been interrupted, he would not have hesitated to make Hannibal regret his decision to flatten him on the carpet. Somehow, his calm seemed to flee when confronted with Hannibal's presence. His husband had no good effect on him, and Will seemed to bring out the worst in him. Rather, they brought the worst out in one another. Adding a child to this nonsense was just folly, and they both knew it. So why on earth would Hannibal even consider it long enough to bring it up? "A cruel joke," Will said, knowing it was the only reason possible. "A cruel joke and nothing more. I should leave here no matter what the Duke says. Surely he would see for himself that Hannibal and I cannot share even so large a house as this. And if they did clash, which was inevitable, and the Duke could see for himself there was no cause to hope, then perhaps he would consider an annulment after all. It was the only option he could see working, one he had begged for more than once in the past 6 years. The Duke, tight-lipped and grim, had steadfastly refused to annul their marriage, telling Will that some day Hannibal would make all of this up to him. But Will was entirely out of patience, and he would not wait any longer, not with Hannibal back and so strangely, reluctantly conciliatory. Nodding to bolster his renewed confidence, Will tugged once more on his jacket, lifted his chin, and quietly left his suite. Mr. Hawks softly informed him that the family was in the day-room, and that tea and cakes had been served. "Thank you, Mr. Hawks," Will said, steeling himself to make a good impression no matter what they might believe of his character. "I apologize for any inconvenience my behavior caused." I'm afraid I'm not aware of any behaviour on yours that could cause an inconvenience, Mr. Graham, Mr. Hawkes said, stern in his dignity. Will blushed floridly at that one. A teacup has been broken in my room, Mr. Hawkes. Please have the pieces boxed for me and left on my vanity. Of course, Mr. Graham, Mr. Hawkes said, ever attentive. As for now, the Marquess has asked after you. Unfortunately, Mr. Hawkes, he cannot pretend I do not exist when his relatives descend on us like a murder of crows, Will said, feeling as ungenerous as his summation sounded. I will endeavour not to give them any reason to dislike me more than gossip and conjecture already have. Mr. Hawkes opened the door for him, and Will stopped short, eyes flicking from one to another in turn, and matching them to stories Anthony had told him over the years. The slender blonde woman was Bedelia, Anthony's eldest sister. The spare and frowning older woman was the Duke's daughter, Hannibal's Aunt Grace, who had married Lord Robert Dimmond, the current Earl of Braden. Anthony he knew, of course, but he was not so certain of Bedelia's grown children, who had spouses and children of their own. Every one of which was staring at him, and almost half of which were alphas of varying degrees of strength. Will took a deep breath, calming when his senses sorted Hannibal and the Duke out among them. He knew he had nothing to fear from these alphas but their disparagement, but it was threat enough to make him nervously smooth his waistcoat over his trim belly. My gracious, look at you, a young man said, beaming at him, his blue eyes wide and sparkling with appreciation. One of Bedelia's sons, no doubt, from the look of him. Such a delicate young man, is he not? Bedelia said, every nose in the room upturned to catch his scent. Will was deliriously glad that he had used such copious amounts of neutralizer to confound them. Exquisite, Roland, darling, a matronly woman said, nodding her approval to the Duke. Certainly an overdue boon for the family. He's the very image of Charles, isn't he? He certainly is, Margaret, the Duke said to her, beaming at Will, with pride shining in his amber eyes and a fond smile on his lips. Will controlled his trembles with sheer determination, though the slight movement of his dark curls no doubt betrayed him. The married adults were nearly all older than he, interspersed with various children, all of them intensely curious about him. Hannibal was standing near the windows, but his gaze was sharp, offended, and his posture was tense enough to put Will's teeth on edge. Wexley's Omegan spouse sings like a songbird, that same bright-eyed youth called out. Do you sing, Mr. Graham? Oh, you're like a lovely little jeweled darling, aren't you? Bedelia purred, descending on him in a perfume of strong alpha scent and soft silks, her pleasantly pale arm rising to trace her fingers down the side of his throat, just a trace of touch beneath his jaw. Will tipped his head just slightly despite himself, allowing the touch and submitting to it, which made her lovely face even lovelier with delight. She turned her head fluidly to the Duke and said, Grandfather, was badly done of you to hand him over to Hannibal. Hannibal crossed the room in 3 quick strides, his hands clasped behind his back, but his amber gaze livid as he said, It is inadvisable, dear cousin, to test an Omega in such a public setting. You know how easily frightened and scatterbrained they can be. Will bristled at that, knowing that Hannibal was deliberately baiting him, and well aware that he'd pricked up his husband right where it hurt him the most. His pride. Annoyingly enough, Hannibal's scent was the strongest in the room, but at least it rendered the others less intimidating, and managed to be moderately comforting in that respect, however little Will enjoyed it. Bedelia, light of my life, the Duke said, sounding weary. I assure you it was not done thoughtlessly. She turned her attention back to Will, her light blue eyes dancing at Hannibal's scolding. She was a vision of pale beauty, from her light, near-white hair to her icy bright blue eyes, to the delicate shell pink of her smiling mouth. Come along, dearest, yes, she crooned, petting him when no one else dared to touch him, as if his gender was contagious somehow. That, or they feared how Hannibal might react. Bedelia, however, was an alpha much used to dealing with Omegas, and soothed him with gentle strokes and murmurs, keeping him tight to her side as she sat with him near the Duke. Not well done of grandfather at all, I must say. Now stop gawking, the lot of you, the Duke ordered, annoyed at their interests. I can hardly help it, a young lady declared, a young and innocent version of Bedelia. I swear he's precisely like her. I'd no idea she a twin."
"You are certainly not the only one without that knowledge," Hannibal said, annoyed by how genuinely impressed they were, the traitorous bunch. "You could change places with no one knowing," the young man said, grinning so that he looked quite a lot like Anthony.
"Not precisely," Will said, thinking of that awful day over 6 years ago when Mina had conspired to send him here in her place. "But I am sure Lord Clarges would not complain if we did, considering she is a proper woman." There was a startled silence following that statement. Will looked to the Duke, who was not bothering to hide his slight smile, and then at Hannibal, who looked fit to murder him. Anthony laughed, saying,
"The first time I met Will, he was dressed in Lady Rathmore's clothes. Anthony,"
Hannibal warned him,
"keep a civil tongue in your head, or else excuse yourself."
Anthony said nothing more, but his grin proved that there was plenty he would like to add.
"Well, now that we are all together," the Duke said, wheeling his chair closer to the head of the loose group, "may I introduce Hannibal's spouse, William Lecter, formerly Graham, the Omegan child of the Earl of Reddig."
"Reddig?" Uncle Robert echoed, his round face crumpling in concentration.
"Isn't he the one who hunted with you all the time? You were quite close in your youth, if the stories are to be believed." "I was close with his father, Charles, the former Earl, Will's grandfather," the Duke clarified. "The demands of family unfortunately conspired to put distance between us as we aged."
Hannibal moved to the empty seat at his grandfather's right, Will across from him, and nestled cozily next to Bedelia, who looked fairly pleased with herself. The rest of the Dimmond family was strung the length of the room, still curious and watchful, though the younger ones were rapidly becoming bored with adult matters. Hannibal sighed and sipped the tea he was served, staring at Will's studiously blank expression in mingled irritation and concern, their last conversation replaying with uncomfortable clarity. The tick of the mantel clock was annoyingly loud, rattling his desperate composure.
"Well, I can honestly say that 6 years in society have not improved your social graces, Hannibal,"
Aunt Grace loudly announced. He sighed again, knowing with that opening shot there would be no more peace. He carefully settled his cup back into the saucer and gave his Aunt Grace a bland, expectant look. "The children were shocked, brother," Margaret said to the Duke, fanning herself vigorously. "Shocked!"
"I am aware there were unfortunate circumstances surrounding your arrival," the Duke said, angling a repressive look at Hannibal, who turned his own on Will. "I am sure we can all agree that such irresponsible and crude behavior will not be repeated in the future."
"Still, what a sight to set for the children!" Aunt Grace sniffed. "What an example to set!"
"You are profoundly persistent, Aunt Grace," Hannibal remarked, unhappy with her tenacity. "I am afraid the scene was my own fault," Will said, summoning such a forlorn look that Hannibal nearly laughed at him. He then grudgingly recalled that Will was an Omega, and such falsehoods were their stock in trade, which only left him feeling vaguely irritated and wronged on top of amused. "I took it into my scatterbrained head that I should run, you see." "But, darling, why would you run?" Bedelia asked, making over him. The Duke snorted, Anthony grinned, and Hannibal felt a dread certainty that he was not going to come out of this unscathed, and cursed Will's surprisingly convoluted and cunning mind for it ahead of time. "Perhaps you should ask Hannibal," Will said, raising his languid eyes in Hannibal's direction.
"Ha!"
Hannibal barked a short, sharp laugh.
"You scheming little minx, don't you dare turn this on me unless you fancy another meeting with the carpet. There's a marvellous Turkish monstrosity in the library you haven't yet—" "Hannibal!" the Duke snapped, appalled at him. "What on earth has gotten into you?" "I beg your pardon, grandfather," Hannibal said, feeling strangely flushed and upended, which he blamed squarely on the little Omega looking at him with hazy, unfocused eyes that had darkened to near brown in color beneath his thick black lashes. "I find I am not myself today." "What an uncomfortable feeling," Will murmured, his gaze hardening to diamond sharpness. "To not be one's self." Hannibal clenched his teeth abruptly, subsiding, but not liking it one bit. "Grandfather," Bedelia said, shifting her deceptively soft blue gaze to the Duke, a slight smile on her mouth as she expertly turned the subject. "You should have written that Hannibal had returned. We were already at Fernhill. There would have been no bother to call us here.
Only to me," Hannibal said beneath his breath, cutting his amber eyes at his cousin. "Bedelia, you realize how rude it is to show up unannounced." "No more rude than speaking when you are not spoken to, Hannibal. I addressed grandfather, if you recall. That aside, I did send word, through Anthony."
"Ah," Anthony said, grinning. "I must have forgotten to deliver it, I suppose. No matter. We all family, all together."
"Together at long last," Aunt Grace said, complaining. 16 years, Hannibal. 16 years we've been waiting for you to put up or give up your place to our Anthony. And you waste 6 full years bandying about the capital with your tarts refusing to see us, when you should have been here securing the lie of inheritance."
"Indeed,"
Uncle Robert said, adding his own booming complaint to the growing list of Hannibal's misdeeds.
"You are not getting any younger, Hannibal, and it is far past time for Anthony to be married. We have our own family matters that cannot be attended to until you settle yours."
"Honestly," Margaret said, leveling a look at Hannibal that reminded him uncomfortably of his younger years,
"we had assumed that you would gracefully hand off our Anthony that which you clearly do not want. And shame on you indeed, shame. He's a lovely Omega, quite lovely indeed."
"Yes, Hannibal,"
Anthony said, gleeful with all the hounding going on. "I am more than happy to relieve you of your burdens. Merely say the word." Hannibal's mouth tightened. He was certain Will was repressing a smile, and it was oddly irritating to see Bedelia petting him like an oversized cat, mainly because he allowed it without even a hint of violence. He should, by all rights, be flinging teacups about and snarling at people. That would certainly be an interesting distraction. "Your opinion was neither sought nor required, Anthony," Hannibal bit out, glowering at how smug his cousin was. "And to settle the question, you will not be taking even one of my burdens from me, thank you very much. So you are quite free to get yourself married as hastily as possible, preferably to someone who doesn't suit you one whit." Will flinched, and Hannibal subsided, shifting with discomfort.
"Well, he has turned up,"
Uncle Robert said, breaking the uncomfortable silence with his overly loud approval on that count.
"Uncommon though he has been, he has finally turned up."
"Like a bit of good luck, Anthony put in, relishing Hannibal's discomfort. "More along the lines of a bad penny," Will said, his voice mild and bland, his sparkling gaze lifting to Hannibal's and showing nothing but mute fire. There was no limpid grace here, no, as Hannibal well knew. He could look for 1,000 years and find no sign of wilting or widening eyes or Omegan frailty, just a smoldering, awe-inspiring fury that refused to die down. "Stop needling me, you perverse creature," Hannibal said, wrinkling his nose at him in a soft snarl to cover how he had been staring. To Aunt Grace and Uncle Robert he said, "I am here, ready and resigned to doing my duty at last. Have no fear on that count."
"Are you sure you're an Omegan, dear?"
Aunt Grace asked again, peering at Will through a thick pair of spectacles.
"Grace, don't be tiresome," the Duke warned. "Will is an Omega, and kindly cease being so rude."
"It is nothing, grandfather," Will said, straining where he sat, his spine stiff with dignity. "I realize I am not in the least what you all hoped for in your spouse for your heir, and I am certainly not what Hannibal himself hoped for. I apologize for my lack of feminine charm and comfort. My upbringing was unusual for an Omega." "You seem perfectly marvelous to me," the young man said, his grin wolfish. Anthony cuffed him soundly, and Bedelia made a sharp gesture for him to take himself off to the back of the room, which he quickly did under their censure. "Considering we had no chance to see you, Hannibal, last time you visited Hertford House," Bedelia said, "you can understand how eager we were to visit." "Eager to get a glimpse of the Omega your cad of a brother married me off to," Hannibal said, his voice gruff, a frown pulling his mouth down when Will's shoulders slumped slightly. They were back up in a heartbeat, straighter than before, but it bothered him to see it all the same. "I had only mentioned that I was coming over to see grandfather," Bedelia said, all cunning innocence. "I'm afraid once word got round, the whole family wished to come." "Such touching concern for grandfather's health," Hannibal scoffed, glaring at no one in particular, "when not once in 6 years have any of you set foot inside Hertford House."
"How would we dare when you forbid it?"
Margaret asked, tapping her cane on the floor.
Brat, I'd half a mind to take you over my knee and paddle you when I heard. And then we returned to find you making sport of that poor child in the foyer floor, no less. Shocking conduct, Hannibal, terribly uncommon.
I have never banned you from the house, Aunt Margaret, Hannibal flared, feeling put upon. Where did you get such an idea? Will ducked his head again, and Hannibal frowned, making a note to take it up with him later. And I was not making sport of him, your poor child. Poor. Ha! He's a violent-tempered little harpy. Yes, Bedelia said, her mild amusement only fanning the flames of his temper. He seems a perfect fright, Hannibal. Hannibal bit back his reply and settled for glowering at her, which she responded by tucking Will closer to her side. It was a wonder they didn't meld together right there in front of him. He half expected Will to purr from pure spite.
I hope you will show more self-restraint Sunday, Hannibal,
Uncle Robert said, blundering his way into an otherwise dangerous conversation.
I won't have you manhandling anyone and distracting the other guests.
What? Hannibal asked, drawing a blank, his brows rising over his amber eyes. Sunday. Our garden party, of course, Bedelia said, tilting her lovely head. I'm afraid I sent your invitation to the capital. I assume by now it has gone on to your other estate in search of you, though, in all honesty, after 6 years of ignoring my correspondence, and avoiding your family as if your life depended on it, I did not dream you would actually attend.
Ah, the lauded annual Fernhill garden party,
Hannibal sighed, rubbing his forehead. I can hardly wait. As I am here, I cannot possibly refuse.
No, you cannot refuse, the Duke said, disapproving. There's nasty gossip that has come to my attention, and it needs to be dealt with.
I have no concern for gossip, grandfather, Hannibal said. It is a currency in which fools trade,
and in which you carry a very high stock. You have damaged Will's reputation. Let us hope it is not irreparable damage. Your cousin has very kindly extended her invitation, despite your churlish behavior, and you will accept.
Bedelia smiled, pleased, looking rather like a cat herself. Hannibal wrinkled his nose at her again, a slight snarl she was well acquainted with from their childhood years. Then you will naturally be bringing Will, Bedelia said, cocking her lovely head. Unfortunately, no, Will said, before Hannibal could answer, every eye in the room landing on him. Calm and serene, he said, I'll be leaving tomorrow for Marsham-Heath. There's a good deal of work that remains undone there, and the estate requires attention. There was such an air of collective consternation around him that Will almost smiled at it, amused.
Ah, yes, I'd forgotten,
Hannibal said, seizing on the excuse with fervour.
Marsham-Heath is in quite a state. We'll be leaving come morning, I'm afraid.
Will's eyes widened with his own consternation, then narrowed when Hannibal dropped a smug wink at him. He could hardly argue about it now, but he ached with wanting to and clenched his jaw to prevent it.
Neither one of you is doing anything of the sort,
the Duke said, his voice flat and solid.
We will go to the Fernhill garden party, all of us. We'll put this ugly gossip to rest, and by the gods we shall enjoy ourselves immensely.
Will glowered at Hannibal, who glowered right back, each blaming the other for closing that particular escape route.
Perhaps later in the month would be more conducive to your situation to take a holiday, perhaps to the capital,
the Duke said, and Will's cheeks bloomed with rosy colour when he realized that his heat was coming due then. No one else seemed to notice, though Hannibal was thoroughly amused by his maidenly blushes. Will absolutely refused to be anywhere near Hannibal when his heat came. Even being near him for so short a time, he could feel his attachment to the Alpha strengthening. His uncanny imagination instantly supplied him with every reasonable scenario of himself in such a state, and given his experience of his heats these last 6 years, each one increasingly more desperate, he was not about to risk any one of them. He simply wouldn't give Hannibal the satisfaction of having his horrid opinions validated on that count. No, he absolutely refused to be at Hertford House when his heat came. That would simply be too much ammunition for Hannibal's arsenal, and Will well knew it. Even the thought of it broke him out in a cold sweat. There was only so much caution a gentleman could do, after all.
For now,
the Duke said, his assessing gaze not missing Will's sudden absorption with his thoughts.
We are all decided. We will attend the garden party and have a lovely time.
There was a moment of silence that followed his gruff command, broken finally by Anthony, who said,
Will you play for us?
He was on his feet before the request was complete, glad to have an excuse to sit alone, away from so many distracting people. He ignored the burning weight of Hannibal's amber eyes on him, and settled at the harpsichord, setting up sheet music and beginning to play softly as the family began to catch up behind him. It was soothing, and he relaxed slightly, his fingers skimming lightly over the keys, a small smile curving his mouth. A shadow fell over him as he looked up in time to see Anthony arrive. Without asking, the young Alpha sat down on the bench next to him and turned the pages in companionable ease, offering only, "They are dreadfully boring." Will laughed softly at that, knowing that Anthony would much rather be riding or hunting or on his way to the capital to gamble at one of the clubs. "They are currently discussing my marriage prospects," he said, looking over his shoulder at his family. "Dreadfully boring." "You should have more interest," Will suggested, smiling slightly at him. "Whoever she is, she'll be with you for life."
"And I her. Though men are allowed more options than women. Don't fret over it, Will. I have someone who suits me very well."
Will skated a glance his way, laughing softly when Anthony said,
"And if you won't marry me, why, then I have someone already picked out, provided your blasted husband agrees."
"Honestly, it's no wonder people thought I was your lover," Will said, shaking his head, his fingers skimming the keys in automatic response to the notes, even half attentive, still managing to make the harpsichord sing with vibrant melody. "The way you go on, you're a terrible flirt, Anthony. I do hope once you marry that you'll show her more respect than to make eyes at everything with a pulse that comes near you."
"Or them,"
Anthony said, waggling his eyebrows at Will, when he glanced over at him again.
"A few omegas are on offer for me, remember? I've no interest in swaying them one way or another. Pants, skirts, it's all the same to me. It's what's under the clothes that counts."
"Your grandfather would whip you for such talk," Will scolded, moving his hands to his lap when he finished the song. He gave Anthony a repressive look, adding, "You are a gentleman, Lord du Maurier. Pray act like one."
"Then I shall, in a very gentlemanly manner, leave this room and go have a cigarette,"
Anthony whispered, grinning. "Care to join me?"
Will smiled, and without a backwards glance, gladly joined Anthony in leaving a room in which he had no place or purpose in.
Hannibal listened to his family discussing Anthony's potential mates with only half an ear, frowning at the sight of Anthony and Will sharing the harpsichord bench. Will found his cousin amusing, that much was obvious, by the way he smiled and spoke. He played very well, the harpsichord making the sombre piece rather more merry than was intended. "Hannibal, what is your opinion?" "That you should marry Anthony to the ugliest heiress you can suss out," he shot back, annoyed at the interruption. He bristled at the way his cousin's shoulder brushed Will's, and added with sharp irritation, "as quickly as propriety allows for."
"You cannot possibly still be angry at your cousin for doing as he was told,"
Aunt Margaret said, disapproving. To the Duke she said,
"My dearest brother, I had hoped you would speak in Anthony's defense."
"Maggie, now is not the time,"
the Duke said, quelling that particular discussion.
"We must concentrate on Anthony's pending engagement."
"Hannibal," he stood, ignoring Bedelia's second attempt to gain his opinion, and moved towards the harpsichord with every intention to sit between them if need be, blaming his pride rather than his instincts for wishing to separate them. He got no closer than a few paces before Anthony stood and, with Will just behind him, quit the room without a word, every foolish dimond under the age of 30 running off after them, and glad of their sudden fortuitous escape from the boring matters that plagued their elders. Incredibly annoyed by their behavior, Hannibal reluctantly rejoined the family, wondering what on earth the two of them were up to, and why on earth he gave a damn. Amidst a small flurry of young Dimmons, Will and Anthony managed to make their way to the garden, idly watching the youngsters take up an unruly and confounding game of Pall Mall, with no discernible rules, teams, or point system. They played for the fun of it, enjoying the afternoon sun and their youth. Even though he was barely older than some of them, Will felt removed from their carefree enjoyment, aged by his heavy thoughts and circumstances. "You're frowning," Anthony said, standing with Will in the shade of the arbor placed for spectators. Will softened his expression with a smile, saying, "I was thinking. I find my thoughts distasteful recently, now that Lord Clarges has returned."
"Lord Clarges,"
Anthony snorted, amused.
"He is your husband, Will. You can call him by name."
"He has told me to, but he does not see us as equals. It would only rankle his nerves were I to call him by name."
"And rankle them,"
Anthony suggested, grinning at him.
"God knows he's caused you enough grief that there's no harm in giving some in return."
"I have no wish to cause him grief," Will said, smiling a little when the smallest of the children stepped on the hem of her dress and sprawled onto the lawn, only to sit up laughing. "I have caused this family too much grief already."
"You should, by all rights, after all he's done."
"He's been well within his rights. I should not resent him." Anthony was silent for a moment. When he spoke again, it was a low, urgent whisper so the children wouldn't hear. "Will, regarding what I said inside just now, I'm going to make a decision tomorrow," he said, the seriousness of his tone making Will look over at him. "If you have any inkling to escape what Grandfather and Hannibal have done to you, tell me now. Anthony, I mean it, Will. I'm being absolutely serious, not flirting in the least. I'll not be Grandfather's heir, I know that, so there's no fear on that count," he said, leaning close to grasp his shoulders. "We could leave now, even. Just go and let them do whatever it is they need to do to untangle you from Hannibal. Anthony, I appreciate that you're trying to save me, but there's no point in sacrificing your standing with your family for something like me. Someone," Anthony said, giving him a soft shake and uttering a huff of disbelieving laughter. "Gods, listen to how he has you talking. You're a person with feelings, Will. Feelings that Hannibal has dismissed without even a moment of regret. I know that we regard one another as nothing more than friends, but given time, I am certain we could love one another. You're amazing and funny and delightful. I wouldn't regret a thing if I married you." Will's eyes misted with tears as he pressed his hand to his heart where it ached, wounded and wretched, his vast affection for his dearest friend tightening his chest. "You would regret it, Anthony," he said, managing to meet his gaze. "Because I'm bonded to Hannibal." Confusion and understanding flooded Anthony's blue eyes. Brow furrowing, he asked, "When did you—" "We didn't," Will hastily said, flushing. "We haven't. If I have my way, we never will. It happened the day after you brought me here. There was an awful moment between us, and it just happened." "Well," Anthony said, giving his shoulders a squeeze, "that explains so much about the two of you. I thought a time or two that perhaps the two of you had bonded." "Not the two of us," Will corrected, wincing. "Just me. Please, don't tell Hannibal, Anthony. If he knew—" "Gods, if he knew, he'd break you all over again," Anthony said, his tender expression grim. Will nodded, drawing a deep breath to calm himself, comforted by Anthony's warmth and nearness, and wishing things could have gone very differently. Anthony squeezed his shoulders again, gaining his attention once more. He smiled at Will and asked, "Partners in crime, then?" Will nodded vigorously, grinning when Anthony laughed, and hugged him back without restraint when Anthony embraced him. "Well then," Anthony said, setting Will back just enough to make room to roll a cigarette, "if that's your final decision, then let me tell you about a lovely certain someone who won't reject my ardent and smitten proposal." Will laughed at that and said with vast affection, "By all means, Anthony, by all means."